Hello everyone and welcome back to our virtual Mishnah Berurah share. We're holding a Mishnah Berurah Chelik Vav, and we will be learning today Yemir Hashem Daf Tzadik Beis Amid Aleph. We're continuing to learn Hilchos Sukkah, and we pick up today on the top line of Tzadik Beis Amid Aleph in Siman Taf Reish Lamed in the midst of Sif Beis. So let's remember what we discussed in the previous share in Sif Beis. The case that we were dealing with, okay, I got the wrong diagram here. Let's get you the diagram from yesterday. Okay, the case that we were dealing with was this case over here. Let me brighten this up a little bit. Okay, the case that we were dealing with was this case over here, where we had a sukkah that had two walls. This was your first wall, this was your second wall. Okay, two walls. And we wanted to make a third wall in order to make this sukkah kosher. And what the Mechaber told us is that the thing to do is to take a board that's a little bit more than a tefach wide, position it a bit less than 3 tvachim away from the end of this wall. Now we use limud. Limud says that this less than 3 tefach area open over here between the end of the wall and your 1 tefach plus board is really considered closed. So now you have a 4 tefach area that's closed. Then we make a tzuras ha-pesach from here to a lechi that we're going to position over here. So we have our 1 tefach plus board over here. We put up a kaneh, we put up a lechi over here. We put a lechi, we put some kind of a kaneh, some kind of a beam, even a string on top going from one to the other. And now effectively what we've done is we've closed off this entire wall, which is 7 tvachim long, which is the minimum shiur of a sukkah. And now effectively we've created a situation where we have 3 walls, and now the sukkah is kosher. That's the halacha that we were speaking about in the previous shir. Now, on the top line of Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph, the Mechaber told us, Ukeshera, this sukkah now that's been, you were misakin the sukkah in this way, you created the third wall. Ukeshera, this sukkah would be kosher alfa pisha hakonesh al gabeim einoi noigea behen. When you made that tzuras ha-pesach, the halacha is that whatever you're going to use as the beam, the overhead beam that creates the tzuras ha-pesach, it doesn't have to actually be touching the 1 tefach plus board and the lechi at the other corner. It just has to be positioned directly above them, but it could even be much higher than the tops of those pieces of wood. It doesn't have to be laying directly on top of them. Now we have a very interesting Mishnah Berurah over here, Ois Katan Yod Aleph, that really brings up a slightly tangential point. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Ukeshera, not only is this sukkah going to be a kosher sukkah, and you can eat it on sukkahs, but there's another halachic ramification of this tikkun as well. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Va'oz, once you make this tikkun, once you fix up the sukkah in this way, mutar letaltel b'soichai, you will be allowed to be metaltel. You'll be allowed to carry inside the sukkah. Let's say you erected this sukkah in the Rishos Harabim. Now, if it's Shabbos in the middle of Yom Tov, you're not allowed to carry. So, in order to be able to carry inside the sukkah has to have a dinner of a Rishos HaYachid. Now, normally, when we learn Hilchos Shabbos, if we would go to Siman Shin Samach Gimel, which we learned together, if you would go to Siman Shin Samach Gimel, you would see that ordinarily, for an enclosed area to be considered a Rishos HaYachid, it has to be enclosed on all 4 sides. Over here, we're creating a sukkah that has 3 walls. It doesn't have 4 walls. Yet, says the Mishnah Berurah, Va'oz, once you're misakin the sukkah in the way that the Mechaber has described, and now you have a 3-wall sukkah, mutar letaltel b'soichai, you will be allowed to carry inside the sukkah. The sukkah is going to have a din of Rishos HaYachid. You'll also be allowed to transfer. You'll also be allowed to transfer things from the house into the sukkah. If you have a window opening into the sukkah, or you have a door from the house to the sukkah, you can transfer things from the house to the sukkah because you're going from Rishos HaYachid to Rishos HaYachid. And you could do this b'Shabbos shebesay chachag. You could do this on Shabbos that falls out on Sukkos. Even though on any other Shabbos during the year, it would be forbidden, it would be prohibited to be metaltal, to carry in such an enclosure that's only enclosed on 3 sides. Elim ken yesh tikun beruach revius. You would have to have some kind of a tikun on the 4th wall. For Hilchos Shabbos purposes, you need 3 walls, and then you need something done on the 4th wall, either a kaira or a lechi or a tzuras HaPesach. You need something on the 4th wall in order to allow you to carry inside that enclosure. But on Shabbos of Sukkot, that's not true. On Shabbos on Sukkot, once you create a halachically acceptable 3-wall sukkah with no tikkun of any kind on the open 4th wall, that's considered a rishus hayachid, and you can carry inside it. When it's Shabbos of Yom Tov of Sukkot, Imrim, then we say, Migai dehavidoifen le'inyan sukkah, since this area is considered enclosed in the context of Hilchos Sukkah, since literally the words here mean Migoy dehavidoifen le'inyan sukkah, since in the context of Hilchos Sukkos this is considered to be a wall, meaning that the area is considered to be enclosed even without any tikkun on the 4th side at all. Havinami doifen le'inyan Shabbos, it is also considered enclosed in the context of Hilchos Shabbos, and you're allowed to be metaltal inside that sukkah, even if the sukkah is positioned in Rishus HaRabim, because this enclosure gets a din of a Rishus HaYachid. Nevertheless, Shaloi b'shas hadchak, if this is not a shas hadchak, he brings this down from the Chayodam, Roy lahachmir. There is room to be machmir. It would be proper, Roy lahachmir. It's worthy to be machmir in such a case and not carry, and rather do some kind of a tikkun on the 4th wall if you do need to be metaltal inside this sukkah, which normally you're going to have to be metaltal in your sukkah, or you're going to need to transfer things from inside the house into the sukkah. Now we go to the words of the Ramah, last word on the top line of the Shulchan Aruch Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph. Hagah. The way the Mechaber has described, the way we're going to be misakin this 3rd wall, we have the end of one of the 2 walls of the sukkah. Then we have an empty space slightly less than 3 tefachim, so we could say lavud. Then we have a board that's 1 tefach plus. Then at the other end we have a koneh, and we're going to make a tzuras HaPesach from the 1 tefach plus board until the koneh at the other corner. Says the Ramah, Ve'im tefach v'hadoifen megia l'schach. Now this word doifen, v'hadoifen, the Mishnah Berurah is going to tell us is really a typo. Really it should say v'hakoneh. And what the Ramah is saying is, if the 1 tefach plus board, v'hakoneh, and the lechi, that's at the opposing corner, magia l'schach, if they reach all the way up to the schach, ein tzarich koneh al gabein, then you do not have to erect an overhead koneh in order to complete the tzuras HaPesach. Rather, the schach will act as the overhead koneh, and you'll have a tzuras HaPesach from the 1 tefach plus board, the koneh, and the schach that is above them. Continues the Ramah, Umashe nagu b'tzuras HaPesach agula. This that we have a minig to make a rounded tzuras HaPesach, hu l'noi ba'alma, it's only to beautify the sukkah. Let's see what this means. Let's see what the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Cotton Yud Beis. V'ma tefach v'hakoneh, kein tzarich loymar. That word that we have in our print in the Ramah, v'ma tefach v'hadoifen, that word v'hadoifen is really a typo, and really it should say v'ma tefach v'hakoneh, magia l'schach. Then ein tzarich koneh al gabein, then we don't have to erect an overhead koneh in order to complete the tzuras HaPesach. Ta'aschach gufa yechashev kekoneh al gabein. If the 1 tefach plus board and the koneh go all the way up to the schach so that they meet the schach, then you don't need an overhead beam. You could use the schach as the overhead koneh. Vayin the Magen Avram, however, the Chavetz Chaim says, if you take a look at the Magen Avram, Sheikh Shalzem Yerushalmi, he asks a kasha on this from Yerushalmi, V'daitoi deroy lahachmir, and the opinion of the Magen Avram is that we should be machmir, and we should make an overhead koneh to complete this tzuras HaPesach. We should not rely on the schach, mishum de'enoi nasa haschach lekach, because the schach was not erected to make a tzuras HaPesach. That wasn't the purpose of the schach. Aval ha'achrayim yishvu kushiyasai. However, if you look in the achrayim answer the question that the Magen Avraham had. Valkein, therefore, hasoymech al Ramah lo hifsid. If you rely on this Ramah and you use the schach as the overhead kaneh, lo hifsid, you do not lose out. Now let's go to Siv Gimel. In Siv Gimel, we're going to discuss a slightly different case than the one that we've discussed until now. We're going to have another case of a 3-wall sukkah. Says the Mechaber, Hayu loy shnei defanois zu keneged zu. In the case that we discussed at the beginning of today's shiur and in yesterday's shiur, we were discussing a sukkah that had 2 perpendicular walls. You had one wall and then you had another wall. So you had 2 walls perpendicular to each other at right angles. And the question was, what do we need to do in order to erect a 3rd wall? Now in Siv Gimel, we're going to discuss a sukkah that right now only has 2 parallel walls. So what if you have 2 parallel walls, ubeinehem mefulish, and between the 2 parallel walls, the sukkah is completely opened so that you could walk directly through. You have no closing walls on either side. How are you misaking that sukkah? How do you create a 3rd wall in order to be machshir this sukkah? Explains the Mechaber. The Mechaber says, Oised doifen, we have to make a wall. Sheyesh berach by arba'a tfachim umashu. Now we have to make a board, and the Mechaber does not call it a board, the Mechaber calls it a wall. We have to make a section of wall that is a little bit over 4 tfachim wide. Uma'amidai, and we're going to stand it up, bepachas mishloisha, slightly less than 3 tvachim, samach le'echad mishtei adafanois, close to one of the existing walls. So me and my great artistic ability, or shall I say my non-existent artistic ability, what I did was like this. Here we have the 2 walls of the sukkah. We have 2 parallel walls, one here and one here. So here we have our 2 parallel walls. Now the question is, how could we be misaken a 3rd wall over here? Says the Mechaber, what you have to do is, you have to make a section of wall. If you can see, I wrote 4 tvachim plus over here. You're going to make a section of wall that's a bit over 4 tvachim, and you're going to stand it up a distance of slightly less than 3 tvachim away from one of these 2 corners. What does that do? Well, now we say limud. Limud says that this gap is closed. So take this gap of slightly under 3 tvachim, add it to the 4 tefach plus section of wall that you created over here, and guess what? Now we have a perfectly kosher sukkah wall. We have a 7 tefach wall here. So now we actually have 2 perpendicular walls. We have a wall here, a perfect wall, and we have a perfect wall over here. That's 2 walls. Now we also have a 3rd wall over here. So now we have a 3-wall sukkah. So again, let's just read this inside again, now that I explained it to you. Oised doifin, you make a section of wall. Sheyesh berach by arba tvachim umashu. That's 4 tvachim and a bit wide. Uma'amidai, and you stand it up. Bepachas mishloisha samach le'echad mishtei adafanis. Slightly less than 3 tvachim away from one of your perpendicular walls. Ukeshera, and now the sukkah is kosher. Now, before we go weiter in the Mechaber, let's take a look here at the Mishnah Berurah, Ois Katan Yodalet. Oised doifen. Now, if you notice, there's a key difference between the way we're misaken this sukkah that has 2 parallel walls, and the way we were misaken the sukkah in the previous shiur, which had 2 perpendicular walls. When we dealt with 2 perpendicular walls and we wanted to create a 3rd wall over here, what we said was, go slightly less than 3 tvachim away from this end and make a board that's 1 tefach plus thick. Right? That's all we needed. We needed a board slightly over a tefach. We said limud from here to that board, and now we closed up an area of 4 tvachim, a gap of slightly less than 3, and a board of slightly over 1. So we have a section now closed up of 4. That gave us roiv. It gave us a doifen of 4 tvachim, which is also roiv of 7. So it's a significant doifen because it's 4 tvachim wide, and it's roiv of 7. So now we consider this wall closed. But we also had to make a lechi from the 1 tefach plus board to a kaneh that we put up over here. And in that way, we imagined that we were closing off the entire third side. In today's situation, where we have the 2 parallel walls, in a sense, we're being a little bit more machmir. Because when we have the 2 parallel walls, and we want to create a third wall over here, we're not using a 1 tefach plus board over here. We're using a 4 tefach plus board here. And we're putting it less than 3 tefachim away from this corner. So we're closing up a 7 tefach section. And we're closing up a whole 7 tefach section. We're using slightly less than 3 of limud, and then a board of 4 plus, for a total of 7. Why are we being more machmir here by the 2 parallel walls than we were by the 2 perpendicular walls? That's the question that this Mishnah Berurah is coming to answer. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Umad de la Maila dai betefach, this that in Sif Beis. We said all we need in the case of the 2 perpendicular walls, we only needed a board that was 1 tefach plus, and over here we need a board of 4 tefachim plus. This that earlier we got away with only a tefach plus. The Hassam, because over there, hashtei defanoi smuchais lahadadi. That's because in that case the 2 existing walls were touching each other. There were 2 perpendicular walls that met at a right angle at a corner. Therefore, dai b'shlishi b'tefach ba'alma. Now, when we create the third wall, it's enough to only use a 1 tefach plus board and only use limud to close up a 4 tefach section and make the rest of the 7 using a tzuras haPesach. Now, the logic over here seems to be, according to the Achronim, that when you have 2 perpendicular walls, the area that's sort of contained within the 2 perpendicular walls is considered to be more enclosed than an area enclosed by 2 parallel walls. 2 parallel walls don't really enclose anything because it's very easy to travel straight through. But when you have 2 perpendicular walls, you can't travel straight through. You could go in and you could go out, but this is a more effective enclosure than this is. Therefore, when we're dealing with this case of the 2 perpendicular walls and we want to create a third wall, we could be more makel. We could say put up a 1 tefach plus board within 3 tefachim of this corner and close off a 4 tefach section and then make it tzuras haPesach. But when we're dealing with 2 parallel walls, we need a more substantial wall at the third wall. How are we going to make that more substantial wall? What we're going to do is we're going to have the 2 parallel walls, and we're going to use limud and a 4 tefach plus board to actually close an area of 7 tefachim, right? Because remember, gap of 3 tefachim minus a bit, and board of 4 tefach plus. That gives us an enclosure of a full 7 tefachim. So now we have our 2 parallel walls plus an actual 7 tefach enclosure. That's what we need in the case of the parallel walls. In the case of the perpendicular walls, we could be more makel. So again, I'm going to read Ice Cut and Yodalit inside from the beginning. This that in the previous case of Sif Beis, in the case of the 2 perpendicular walls, we were makel and we could use a board of 1 tefach plus. That's because over there you have 2 existing walls that connect to each other. They touch and they meet at right angles at a corner. And therefore for the third wall we could use this kunz of a 1 tefach plus board. That contrasts that to our case here in Sif Gimel, where we're dealing with 2 parallel walls that are distanced from each other, and they don't really make an enclosure. Therefore we have to be more machmir, and we actually have to make a 4 tefach wall, a wall of 4 tefach plus a bit, and to stand it up slightly less than 3 tefachim, close to the end of one of the parallel walls, to have it kilavud, and then we're going to use limud. The next shav, and now it's considered ki'ilu haya doifin shalem shal shivat tefachim samach ladoifin. Now, in this case, this extension that we created, which is comprised of a slightly less than 3 tefach gap and a board of 4 tefachim plus, is actually considered a full 7 tefach wall. And a full 7 tefach wall is a fully kosher wall of a sukkah, because the minimum share of a sukkah is 7 tefachim. And now it comes out, and now, guess what we're really dealing with? Now, once again, we have 2 perpendicular walls and a third wall. And that's why this is a good tikkun. Now, the Mechaber gets a little bit more complicated. Let's go back to the Mechaber now. We're in the middle of Sif Gimel. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines down in the Shulchan Aruch, right by the Ois Cotton Tesvav for the Mishnah Berurah. Now, the Mechaber throws in a monkey wrench. And he says, even though using limud and your 4 plus tefach board, you have now created an actual extension of 7 tefachim. So now you actually have 2 perpendicular walls and a third parallel wall. Still in all, the gam bazeh tzarich lasais tzuras haPesach. We still have to make a tzuras haPesach. Where is this tzuras haPesach going to go? Sheyitein koneh. You're going to put an overhead beam, an overhead koneh. Mei hapas, from the 4 tefach plus board that you erected, al hadoifen ha'echad, to the opposing wall. So what that means is like this. Here's your extension. Here's your 3 plus, your minus, your gap of a bit under 3 that you're going to use limud to close, and your pas arba, your board that's a bit over 4. Now you're going to make a tzuras haPesach from here to here, to the end of the other parallel wall. So you're going to close off the entire third side now. How are you going to close off the entire third side? You're going to have your extension, and then you're going to close off the gap after the extension with a tzuras haPesach. So you're going to close off the entire third wall. That's the opinion of this Deya Rishona. This first opinion brought by the Mechaber is that you must have a extension of a tzuras haPesach. Ois cotton tesvav, v'gam bazet tzarich lasos tzuras haPesach. Ayin b'Magen Avram. He says, take a look at the Magen Avram. Shemistapek, he has a suffix. He says, ulai dafka b'sukkah ketana kosher. Maybe this whole din of a tzuras haPesach, maybe this only works by a sukkah ketana. And if you look at the Magen Avram, when he speaks about a sukkah ketana, he means a sukkah where the gap between the 2 parallel walls is less than 10 tefachim. You see, if that gap is less than 10 tefachim, then do the math. You made an extension. The extension is a gap of slightly less than 3, plus a pas, a board, of slightly over 4. So your extension is 4 tefachim. If the sukkah is under 10, then what do you have left? What you're going to have left over here, you have, the area that you're closing off is 7 tefachim. My mistake. You have 7 tefachim closed off. Excuse me 1 second. Let me shut that annoying ring off. You're closing off an area. Let me get back here. Okay. You're closing off an area of 7 tefachim over here, because you have your gap of slightly less than 3 and your board of 4 and a bit. Now, if your whole sukkah is 10 tefachim wide, so that between the parallel walls you have 10 tefachim, your board of 4 plus is within 3 tefachim of the opposing wall, right? Because this extension is 7, so you're within 3 of the opposing wall. In that case, by making this extension, the end of the extension is already within limud of this wall. In that case, the Magen Avram says you could effectively close off the third wall by using your limud and pas extension, and then another limud to the other side. But if the sukkah is larger than that, if the gap between the 2 parallel walls is more than 10 tefachim, then you exceeded the limud gap on the other side of the extension. And in that case, even a tzuras haPesach will not work. The logic of the Magen Avram seems to be that the Magen Avram holds that the extension that you make to close the third wall, these two walls have to actually be connected. A tzuras HaPesach does not make them connected. A tzuras HaPesach makes it effective mechitza on the third side, but it does not serve to connect the two parallel walls. Where limud does make a connection between the two parallel walls. So that's why the Magen Avram seems to be more makmir. So Ayin b'Magen Avram shemistapik ulai dafka b'Sukkah ketana kosher, avol b'Sukkah gedola shashlish is rechoka mimena harbe, where the parallel wall, which we're calling the third wall, this is one wall, the extension is another wall, and this is the third wall. If it's rachok harbe, if it's more than 10 tefachim away, loy mahani afilai yidei tzuras HaPesach, maybe even a tzuras HaPesach doesn't work. Avol harbe achronim iskimu dein lechalik pozeh, but the consensus of many achronim is not to make this chiluk of the Magen Avram's. Okay, so here we had this Dea Rishona that says that you must have a tzuras HaPesach. However, if we go back into the Mechaber, 6 lines down by the Ois Cotton Tezayin for the Mishnah Berurah, V'yesh Oimrim she'ein zet tzarich tzuras HaPesach. There are those that say that we don't need a tzuras HaPesach. If we have our 2 parallel walls and our 7 tefach extension that we made, there's no need to close this gap off with a tzuras HaPesach. Because once we have this extension of 7 tefachim, we have a fully kosher Sukkah wall. We don't need a tzuras HaPesach. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Nice cotton tezayin. V'yeshaymim she'ein zet tzarich tzuras HaPesach. Deloidami l'sif beis. Because there's a very great difference between this case and the case of the 2 perpendicular walls in Siv Beis. There's a critical difference. Shesham hatikun b'pas of tefach. Over there, what did we do? In the case of the 2 perpendicular walls, we had to make a third wall. To make that third wall, we put up a board over here that was only 1 tefach plus thick. What did we gain by putting up that board? What we gained was, we have a gap of slightly less than 3 tefachim. We add to that a board that's 1 tefach plus thick. So now we have a closure of how many tefachim? 4. What's the yachas of 4 tefachim? Well, 4 tefachim is a valid mechitza. It has the minimum size of 4 tefachim, and it's a roiv of 7. All right. Do we have a 7 tefach complete wall? No. We have a 7 tefach wall with a kunz. We have roiv. Now we add a tzuras HaPesach to complete the 7. So in this case of Siv Beis, how are we making 7 tefachim? We're making 7 tefachim with a pile of kunzin. We're making limud to close the gap of slightly under 3 tefachim. Then we're reaching the critical limit of 4 tefachim by adding a board of a tefach plus. So now we have roiv of 7, and then we're closing off the rest of the 7 with the tzuras HaPesach. Says the Mishnah Berurah. The Mishnah Berurah explains that works okay in that case. You need that tzuras HaPesach in Siv Beis because that's the only way you're reaching 7. Because over there, the only board that we erected is 1 tefach plus. So when we add that 1 tefach plus to the gap of slightly under 3, we only arrive at a closure of 4. So since we only have a closure of 4, we need an additional extension of a tzuras HaPesach to hit the minimum share of 7. Sha'atikun hu garua. Over there in that case, we're using a very garua dika, a very ineffective, not ineffective is a bad word, inferior. We're using a very inferior closure. This is a very inferior wall. Limud and the board only gives us 4 tefachim. How do we hit 7? So we need the tzuras HaPesach to complete 7. Al kain tzarich tzuras HaPesach lahashlam shiur. We need the tzuras HaPesach to hit 7. Masha ain't kain kan. But that's not our case over here with the 2 parallel walls. Masha ain't kain kan sheyesh tikun toiv bepas arba. Over here, we're using a board of 4 tefachim plus. And using our 4 tefach plus board together with the gap of slightly under 3, we have a fully valid closure of 7. So what do we need a tzuras HaPesach for? We already have 7. That's why in this case they hold that we don't need a tzuras HaPesach. Because the Akrayim right, yesh lahachmir kesvara rishona, even though this argument is a very compelling argument, still the Akrayim say yesh lahachmir kesvara harishona. Okay, now let's go to the Ramah. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 6 lines down the middle of the line. Haga. Aval im ika doifen shiva beloy lavud. Let's say we have two parallel walls, and we actually have a 7 tefach third wall. We're not using any kunsen. We're not using lavud. We're not using a pas. We have a 7 tefach wall. In that case, says the Ramah, im ika doifen shiva beloy lavud. If you have a third wall that's already 7 tvachim, ain't tzarkan tzuras HaPesach hatzoifa kaisel. You don't have to make a tzuras HaPesach over here. If this third wall is already 7 tvachim, so here you have 2 perpendicular walls. Here you have a third parallel wall. There's no need for me to close this gap using a tzuras HaPesach. Ain't tzarkan tzuras HaPesach hatzoifa kaisel. Hayol ve'ikadoifen shiva shu shir hechsha sukkah. Because we have a perfectly valid third wall that has the 7 tefach minimum of the size of a sukkah. The chol shekain, and certainly the Ramah says, she'ein tzrichim tzuras HaPesach keshahadoifen shlema. Certainly, if we have a full 3 walls, we don't need a tzuras HaPesach to close off the 4th wall. If you have 3 full walls, you have a perfectly kosher sukkah. We learn that from Sukkah. You only need 3 walls for a sukkah. No need to make a tzuras HaPesach of any kind at the 4th wall. And this minig that you see by some people, that even though they have a full 3 walls, they make a tzuras HaPesach by the 4th wall, that's einoi elo lenoi ba'alma. They do that for decorative purposes, for zekeli va'anveyu, but they don't do it for halachic reasons. It's completely not necessary. It's completely irrelevant. Says the Mishnah Berurah, if you have a third wall that has the minimum share of a sukkah, if you have a third wall that is 7 tvachim, you don't need a tzuras HaPesach over here to close up the gap between the 7 tefach wall and the other wall. There's no need for that. What the Ramah wants to say is, over there, both according to the Day of Rishona and the Day of Shnia, there's no need for a tzuras HaPesach. I feel the Day of Rishona. Because you have a perfectly valid, complete 7 tefach wall. Now, this is true even if the situation is such where you have your 2 perpendicular walls here, right? You have this 7 tefach wall, and the third parallel wall is quite a distance away. You still don't need to close this gap with a tzuras HaPesach. Since the bottom line is you have 3 walls to the sukkah, you don't need to do anything to close off that gap. However, says the Mishnah Berurah, umistabra, it makes sense to say that dafke im haricha kula yoser me'asar amos. That's only true if the gap from your extension over here to the other parallel wall is not more than 10 amos. If this gap from here to here is more than 10 amos, then already you have a problem. Why? What's the difference? Because explains the Mishnah Berurah, the nechshav zeke pesach. As long as you're within 10 amos, we consider up to 10 amos to be a doorway. So if it's less than 10 amos, that gap is considered a doorway. It's not considered a breach that totally removes the third parallel wall. And we'll discuss that in greater detail in Sif Hey. Certainly you don't need a tzuras HaPesach if you have 3 full walls of a sukkah. You don't need a tzuras HaPesach to close off the 4th wall. What he means to say over here is b'doifen revi. We don't need a tzuras HaPesach to close off the 4th side of the sukkah. Okay, let's try to get Sif Dalet under our belt. Sif Dalet. B'amed dvarim amurim. When do all these halachos apply? All of this applies when you're building your sukkah of 2 parallel walls and there is no wall in the middle, opposite, perpendicular to the two parallel walls. So, like the Mechaber said in the outset of Siv Gimel, you have two parallel walls, ubeineim mefulish, and between them it's open. You could travel right through. So there's no wall blocking off perpendicular to the two parallel walls so that you can't go through. Aval ha'oises sukasai be'emtza hachotzer. However, very interesting case. Me and my non-existent artistic abilities. Let's see. I have to get my daughter to draw me some diagrams. However, let's say you make a sukkah in middle of a chotzer. Okay? So you see these walls here? See these three walls here? These are three walls of a chotzer, of a courtyard. Now you made a sukkah in middle of the chotzer. You put up two parallel walls, one here and one here. Two parallel walls in middle of the chotzer. Now, are these two parallel walls, and between them it's mefulish? Between them it's wide open? Not really, because you have the back wall of the chotzer. Now, even though the back wall of the chotzer is not a wall of the sukkah, but it is perpendicular to your two parallel walls. Now, in that case, says the Mechaber, if you make your two parallel walls of your sukkah in the middle of a chotzer, rachuk midafanes chotzer, but you made it far away from the walls of the sukkah. The back wall of the chotzer is far away from your two parallel walls. They're not touching. There's a big gap over here. In that case, even though in reality all you have for the sukkah are your two parallel walls, in this case, says the Mechaber, we revert back to the tikkun of Sif Beis. We have two perpendicular walls. Now in Sif Gimel we said, when you have two perpendicular walls, in order to close off your third wall, let's say this wall over here, what would you need? You would need your board of 4 tefachim plus within 3 tefachim of this corner to make a 7 tefach enclosure, and then you have the machlokes, do you need a tzuras HaPesach over here or not? Says the Mechaber, in this case, where you have this back wall of the chotzer, you don't have to be machmir, you don't need that tikkun. Instead, you could go back to the tikkun of Siv Beis in the case of the sukkah that has two perpendicular walls. And now you could close off wall number 3 with a board that's 1 tefach plus, that's within 3 tvachim of the wall, and then it's tzuras HaPesach. You could revert back to the more lenient, to the more easy, the easier tikkun of Siv Beis. You don't need the more chamer tikkun of Siv Gimel. Why is that the case? Let's see the Mishnah Berurah. Says the Mishnah Berurah is cut in chaf be'emtza hachotzer. Mikar din zehu meharan. The makar, the source for this kula, is a ran. Now, if you look at the ran, what's the basis of the ran? So, if you remember earlier in the shiur, I pointed out to you that when you have an area that's enclosed by two perpendicular walls, that's considered to be more effectively enclosed than an area that's enclosed by two parallel walls. And since that's true, we could be more makel in this case. And in this case, all we need is the board of 1 tefach plus within 3 tefachim of this end to give us a halachadika enclosure of 4 tefachim, which is roiv of 7, and then a tzuras HaPesach that goes to the end that gives us a 7 tefach halachadika wall. But in this case of the two parallel walls, where we don't have an effective enclosure, we have to be more machmer. We need an extension of a board that's 4 tefach plus, positioned within 3 tvachim of this wall, to give us an actual 7 tefach wall over here. Says the Ran, in this case over here, where you built your sukkah inside a chotzer, and you have this wall, the back wall of the chotzer, that's more similar to the case of the two perpendicular walls, because in this case, this area that's enclosed between the two parallel walls is more effectively enclosed because it's enclosed also by the back wall of the chutzner, and therefore we could be makel like we are in the case of the two perpendicular walls. That's the source of this halacha of Sif Dalet. However, continues the Mishnah Berurah in Eis Katan Chaf, you take a look at the Magen Avram learns this Ran differently. It is the opinion of the Magen Avram that this kula of the Ran only applies when the two parallel walls of the Sukkah heim atzmam dafnois hachotzer. The Magen Avram says, you want to know which case the Ran is talking about? The Ran is talking about this case over here. This case over here, I don't have a sukkah erected inside a chutzner. I don't have two parallel walls of a sukkah put up within a chutzner. Instead, what I have is, I have a chutzner. I have three walls of a chutzner. I'm using two parallel walls of the chutzner as my sukkah walls. And I put up schach going from one of the parallel walls to the other. But I'm not using the back wall of the chutzner for my sukkah. If you notice, there's no schach over here. This back wall of the chutzner is very far away from the section of the chutzner that I'm using as the sukkah, that I covered with schach. And therefore, this back wall is not really part of the sukkah. Says the Magen Avram, that's the case where the Ran says this kula, and says, you want to close off a third wall? Let's say you want to close off the wall over here. If you want to close off the wall over here, you could use the kula of Sif Beis. You could use a pas of 1 tefach plus, positioned within 3 tefachim of this wall, and then a chutzner, and then a tzuras HaPesach from here to here. Why? Because this area where you put your schach is very effectively enclosed by the two parallel walls of the chutzner and the back wall of the chutzner. Because all three walls, the two parallel walls and the back wall, they're all part of one enclosure. They're all part of one enclosing structure. But, says the Magen Avram, the kula of the Ran does not apply to this case. Because in this case, there's no shaykhis between these two parallel walls and the back wall of the chutzner. They're not part of the same enclosure, so we cannot say that the back wall effectively encloses this area. So, v'daitoi, if we go back to Eis Katan Chaf, v'daitoi, it's the opinion of the Magen Avram, de'ein lahater laharan, you cannot use the kula of the Ran, ela k'sheshtei defanoi zu keneged zu shel hasukkah, heim atzmam dafnoi sachotzer. You can only use the kula of the Ran when the two parallel walls you're using for the sukkah are two parallel walls of the structure of the chutzner themselves, and they are part of the same enclosure as the back wall of the chutzner. That's when we could use the middle back wall of the chutzner, because it's part of the same enclosure. Even though it's not really a wall of the sukkah, like in the picture that I showed you, where there's no schach over there. So that back wall of the chutzner has nothing to do with the sukkah. Because the bottom line is, it does serve as an enclosure of the area of the sukkah, because the sukkah is not a walk-through. The area that's enclosed, the area of the enclosure of the sukkah, is made up of the two parallel walls of the chutzner and the back wall of the chutzner. But not in the first case, where the two parallel walls are within the enclosure of the chutzner. In this case, what does that mean? The last words of Sif Dalet in the Mechaber, when he says that in this case it's dailo, it's enough b'tikun amater, with the takana that we use to be mater a sukkah kishtei defano isa asuyis kimingam. Dahainu, what he means is the kula of Sif Beis shayam and atefach meruvach. We're going to put up a board of 1 tefach plus b'pachas b'shloisha tefachim samach l'doifen, within 3 tvachim of the end of one of the walls. Okay, very fascinating topics. Thank you so much for joining me for limud HaTorah. The schus of limud HaTorah should be Megan Agans Klal Yisrael. The Rebbe should send Yeshua's refuahs and parnassah to all those in need. And Mir Hashem, we will continue next time with Sif Hey. Be well.